The needle went through the fabric slower than it should have, and the boy's small hands were shaking so badly he pricked his thumb twice before he got the stitch to hold. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the barn, a lantern burning low beside him, and across his lap lay a quilt of blue and cream squares, faded at the edges, patched once already along the bottom row by hands that had been in the ground for 6 winters. He worked in the yellow light with the seriousness of a man performing surgery. He did not hear the boots on the frozen ground outside. He did not hear the door open. He only knew Silas Boone was standing behind him when the cold air rolled in and the lantern flame guttered sideways. The boy froze. He did not turn around. He held the needle where it was, halfway through a patch of pale blue calico, and he waited for the shouting to start. It didn't start. Silas stood in the doorway of his own barn, 43 years old and looking 60 in the low light, and he looked down at what the child had done. The quilt was spread across the boy's knees like a lake. He knew every square of it. He knew the blue one had been cut from a dress Martha wore the first summer they were married. He knew the cream one with the tiny sprigs of yellow had come from her mother's apron. He knew the tear along the bottom edge was where their old dog Toby had caught his claw the winter Martha got sick, and she had laughed about it from her bed and said she'd mend it when she was up again, and she had never been up again. The quilt had been folded inside a cedar chest at the foot of a bed he did not sleep in anymore. Silas had not laid a finger on it in 6 years. "Boy," he said. His voice came out lower than he meant it to. "Where did you get that?" The child did not turn. His shoulders were narrow inside a coat 2 sizes too big, and his hair stuck up in the back like it had been slept on hard. He was maybe 9, maybe 8. Silas had found him 3 days ago behind the feed store in Cold Spring, Wyoming, with a bruise on his cheek the color of a plum and no name he wanted to say out loud. Silas had put him in the wagon without asking and brought him home because the town would have put him on the freight train to Cheyenne by morning, and Silas knew what waited for boys at the end of that line. "Answer me," Silas said softer. The boy's mouth trembled. "The tear was going to get bigger. That ain't what I asked. I saw it in the chest when I was looking for a blanket. I only wanted a blanket. And then I saw the tear, and I could tell somebody loved it once, and I know how to sew. My mama taught me before." He stopped. He pressed his lips together so hard they went white. "I can put it back if you want. I can put it back exactly." Silas stood very still. Outside, the wind moved through the pines behind the barn, and somewhere down at the creek an owl was calling and getting no answer. He had come out here to fork hay to the roan mare. He had a pitchfork still in his right hand. He set it against the wall now, quietly, like a man laying down a weapon he had not realized he was carrying. He walked over and sat down on the straw beside the child. "Before we go any further tonight, settle in wherever you are. Pour the coffee. Pull the blanket up. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing who's out there with us by the fire. And then stay close, because what happened next in that barn is why I'm telling you this story at all." Silas looked at the stitches the boy had made. They were small. They were even. They were better than anything Silas had ever managed in his life, and he had sewn up a horse's flank once with fishing line, and he had sewn up his own arm twice. The boy had used thread he'd found in the tin on the kitchen shelf, Martha's tin, with the painted lid, and he had matched the color to the calico, as close as a child could match anything. "What's your name?" Silas said. "Eli." "Eli what?" The boy's hands tightened on the quilt. "Just Eli." Silas nodded slowly. He understood that answer. He had been a just something once himself, a long time back before Martha, and he had never asked another man to explain a name he did not want to carry. "You're not in trouble, Eli." The child let out a breath that seemed to have been held since Silas walked in. His shoulders dropped a full inch. And then, without warning, without a sound, tears began to run down his face and drop onto the blue calico, and he kept sewing anyway, because his hands did not know what else to do. Silas watched him for a long time. Then he reached out, carefully, the way a man reaches toward a wild thing, and he put his rough hand flat on the boy's back, just between the shoulder blades, and he left it there while the child cried without making a sound. The lantern burned lower. The wind kept moving in the pines. And inside Silas Boone, something that had been frozen solid for 6 years cracked, all at once, like a pond in April. By morning the quilt was on the kitchen table, and Eli was asleep beneath it on the bench by the stove, and Silas was standing at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the sun come up over the ridge above Cold Spring. He had not slept. He had sat in the chair across from the boy most of the night, and he had watched the small chest rise and fall, and he had thought about all the years he had spent believing he had nothing left to give anyone. Then he heard the horses. 3 riders were coming up the wagon road from town. He recognized the lead horse before he recognized the man on it. Cyrus Lowe rode a tall black gelding with a white blaze, and Cyrus Lowe owned half the land between Cold Spring and the Powder River, and Cyrus Lowe did not ride out to a neighbor's ranch at first light unless he was coming to take something. Silas set the cup down. He walked to the door. He did not pick up the rifle by the frame, though his hand passed near it. Cyrus reined up in the yard and did not dismount. The 2 men behind him were younger and armed and had the flat, patient eyes of men who had been paid enough not to ask questions. Cyrus looked down at Silas with a smile that never touched anything above his mouth. "Silas," he said, "heard you took in a stray." "Heard from who?" "Doesn't matter. Word travels. Boy belongs to my sister-in-law's household, over in Cold Spring. He ran off before she could send him where he was going. She'd like him back." Silas did not answer for a moment. He looked at the 2 younger men. He looked at the rifle scabbard on Cyrus's saddle. He looked at the white blaze on the black horse. "Your sister-in-law," Silas said slowly. "The one married to Preacher Doyle." "That's the one. The boy had a bruise on his face the size of my fist when I found him behind the feed store." Cyrus's smile stayed exactly where it was. Boys fall. Boys fall on their own faces from 4 feet up, and it don't leave a mark like that. "Silas." Cyrus leaned forward in the saddle, and the leather creaked. "The boy is Doyle's ward. The paper's signed. You give him back, or the sheriff comes out here this afternoon, and we do it the ugly way. You've been alone out here a long time. Nobody in Cold Spring is going to side with a man who steals a preacher's ward. Think it through." Silas thought it through. He thought about Preacher Doyle, whom he had known for 11 years and had never once trusted. He thought about Doyle's first wife, who had died of a fall down the parsonage stairs the same winter Martha died of the fever, and how nobody in Cold Spring had ever quite been allowed to look at the body. He thought about Cyrus Lowe, who had wanted Silas's south pasture for 4 years and had been told no 4 times. He thought about the boy asleep under the quilt. "Come back this afternoon with the sheriff," Silas said quietly, "and we'll see what paper you actually have." Cyrus's smile finally dropped. He looked at Silas the way a man looks at an animal he has decided to shoot later, not now, but soon. He tipped his hat and turned the black gelding and rode out of the yard, and the 2 younger men followed, and Silas stood in the door until the sound of the hooves was gone from the road. Then he went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table across from the sleeping boy, and he laid his hands flat on the quilt, and he said, out loud, to no one, "Martha, I'm going to need you today." The stove ticked. The boy breathed. Outside, the wind picked up. Eli woke at 9, and Silas fed him 3 eggs and a piece of bread with honey on it. And while the boy ate, Silas asked him, in a voice as gentle as he owned, to tell him exactly what had happened at the parsonage. Eli set his fork down. He looked at the quilt folded on the corner of the table. He looked at Silas. "He hit my mama," he said. "Last winter. She was working there. She was sick already, and he hit her because she dropped a plate, and she fell down, and she didn't get up right. And then she got worse, and she died in the room off the kitchen, and he told the town she had the fever." Eli's voice was flat and steady, the voice of a child who had already said this to himself 1,000 times in the dark. "And then he kept me because he said I owed him for her keep. And when I was bad, he would put me in the cellar. And 2 days ago I got out through the coal chute, and I ran." Silas did not speak. He could not, for a moment. He watched a fly walk across the honey pot, and he waited until his throat unlocked. "Eli," he said finally, "would you tell that to a judge?" The boy's eyes went wide, and then, slowly, they narrowed with a hardness no 8-year-old should own. "Yes, sir." Even if Preacher Doyle was in the room. "Yes, sir." Silas nodded once. He stood up. He went into the bedroom he had not slept in for 6 years, and he opened the top drawer of the dresser, and he took out a folded piece of paper that Martha had made him keep, and he took out the small brass badge underneath it. The badge said Deputy, Cold Spring County, 1878 to 1881. He had not worn it since the year before Martha got sick. He had put it away because she had asked him to, because it had taken him too far from home too many nights, and he had promised her he would stay close from then on. He put the badge in his coat pocket. He picked up the paper. He walked back out to the kitchen. "Now let me ask you something," and I want you to sit with it for a moment before we go on. If you were Silas Boone that morning, a man alone 6 years, a man with nothing to lose and nothing left to give, would you have opened the door when they came back with the sheriff? Would you have trusted the law in a town where the law had signed the preacher's paper? What would you have done in his place? Tell me down in the comments. I want to know. Because here is what Silas did. The riders came back at 3. Cyrus Lowe was in front. The sheriff of Cold Spring County, a soft, watery man named Emmett Pryor, who had been elected on Cyrus Lowe's money 3 winters running, was beside him. And behind them, on a gray mare, sat Preacher Doyle in his black coat with his black hat pulled low and his hands folded on the pommel like a man arriving at a wedding. 6 other riders came behind them. Silas counted them. He did not move from the porch. Eli was inside, behind the wood stove, with the quilt around his shoulders and Silas's old Colt on the floor beside him and firm instructions not to touch it unless a man other than Silas came through the door. Sheriff Pryor cleared his throat. Silas, we got a warrant. Let me see it. Pryor held out a folded paper. Silas did not step down off the porch to take it. Cyrus rode forward and passed it up, and Silas unfolded it, and he read it slow, because he had a great deal of time, and Cyrus Lowe did not know it yet. He handed it back. This warrant says the boy is Ezekiel Doyle's ward by paper filed February of this year. That's right. Ezekiel Doyle's ward, Silas said, would be his wife's son. Wife's dead 10 months. This paper is signed May. That's a preacher taking a dead woman's child 3 months after burying her, without a court, without a judge, and without a witness who wasn't paid by Cyrus Lowe. That ain't a warrant. That's a note Doyle wrote himself. Preacher Doyle's face did not change. Cyrus Lowe's smile came back. Silas, Cyrus said, hand over the boy. No. The 6 riders behind them moved their hands closer to their holsters. Sheriff Pryor licked his lips and looked at Cyrus, and Silas saw the exact moment Pryor understood he was in something he was not going to be able to walk out of clean. And that was when Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass badge. He did not put it on. He just held it up in the flat afternoon light so all of them could see it. I was a deputy of this county for 3 years, he said, under Sheriff Coleman before you, Emmett. That badge was never returned, meaning I never resigned, meaning under the county statute, which you can look up because Coleman wrote it himself. A former deputy holding an unresigned badge may make a lawful arrest for a felony committed in his presence or upon sworn statement of a witness. He looked at Preacher Doyle. I have a sworn statement, he said, from the boy, of the murder of Ruth Callan in the parsonage kitchen last February. He heard, distinctly, the small sound of Preacher Doyle's breath catching. You can't prove a word of it, Doyle said. It was the first thing he had said. His voice was smoother than Silas remembered. The boy is a liar. He is a thief. He ran from a Christian home. Then you won't mind riding into Cheyenne with the boy and me and telling that to the federal judge, Silas said. Because I have the badge and the statement, and by county law that means I take you in today, and Cheyenne is the closest court that Cyrus Lowe don't own. The word Cheyenne landed in the yard like a horseshoe on a barn floor. Cyrus Lowe stopped smiling for the second time that day. The 6 riders looked at Cyrus. Sheriff Pryor looked at his own hands. And Preacher Doyle looked, for one clean half-second, at the road behind him, and Silas saw the thought cross his face, and Silas raised the rifle that had been leaning against the porch post the whole time and put the barrel a level distance from the buttons of the preacher's black coat. Don't, Silas said. You will not make that ride. Nobody moved. The wind moved. A jay called from the pines. The roan mare in the barn stamped once. And Cyrus Lowe, because Cyrus Lowe was a businessman first and a bully second, and because Cyrus Lowe had understood in the last 30 seconds that the preacher was going to fall no matter what he did next, Cyrus Lowe backed his horse 2 steps and lifted his hands, palms out, and said, Sheriff, do your duty. Sheriff Emmett Pryor sat on his horse and understood that his life had just been handed back to him with a condition on it. He climbed down. He took Preacher Doyle's arms and put irons on them. He did not look Doyle in the face. Silas lowered the rifle only when the irons clicked. The 6 riders turned their horses and rode back toward Cold Spring without a word from any of them, and Cyrus Lowe rode with them, because Cyrus Lowe understood that his usefulness to himself required distance from what happened next. That night the fire was low in the stove and Eli was on the bench again. and the quilt was around his shoulders, and Silas was sitting across from him at the table with a cup of coffee he had actually drunk this time. They took him, Eli said. It was not a question. They took him. To Cheyenne. To Cheyenne. The boy was quiet a long moment. His fingers found the torn edge of the quilt, where he had made his careful stitches the night before, and he ran his thumb over them the way a man runs a thumb over a scar to be sure it is his. Mr. Boone, he said, am I going to have to go back? Silas put his cup down. He looked at the child across the table from him. This small stranger with his mother's careful hands and his mother's grave in a churchyard nobody would visit, and Silas felt 6 years of stopped-up living move all at once through his chest. Eli, he said, you're not going anywhere you don't want to go? Not ever again. Not while I'm breathing. The boy did not cry this time. He nodded, once, very seriously, like a man accepting an offer of work. And then he did something Silas did not expect. He got up off the bench, and he walked around the table, and he laid his forehead against Silas's shoulder, and he stood there. Silas put his hand on the back of the boy's head. Strange, Silas said, mostly to himself, how the things you gave up on tend to come find you anyway. He did not know he was speaking the whole shape of his life aloud. He only knew that the boy nodded against his shoulder like he had heard it, and understood it, and would carry it. If this story is finding you tonight where you sit, then you're exactly who I'm telling it to. A like, a subscribe, that's how you tell me to keep going. That's how you tell me there's still someone by the fire. The trial in Cheyenne took 9 days. Eli sat in a wooden chair with his feet not quite reaching the floor, and he told the federal judge what he had told Silas at the kitchen table, and he did not look away from Preacher Doyle once. A woman came forward, the housekeeper who had been sent away the week Ruth Callan died, and she told the court what she had seen through the pantry door. A doctor from Laramie who had examined the body before Doyle had it buried in a hurry testified that the marks on Ruth Callan's neck did not come from any fall. And Sheriff Emmett Pryor, who understood that his own survival now depended on the strength of his memory, remembered a great deal that he had previously forgotten. Preacher Ezekiel Doyle was convicted of murder in the 2nd degree and sentenced to hang. Cyrus Lowe was named in the proceedings as a party to the concealment. His fine took every acre he owned east of the Powder River. The south pasture he had wanted from Silas for 4 years went, at auction, to a widow from Casper who paid for it in cash and named it after her dead son. Cyrus lived out the rest of his life in a rented room above a saloon in Buffalo, Wyoming, and drank himself thin and died in a bed nobody owned. Silas Boone came home from Cheyenne with a boy in the wagon beside him and a paper in his coat pocket signed by a federal judge that said Eli Callan was, from that day forward, his lawful son. The paper had been Martha's idea. Silas was sure of it. He did not know how. He just knew. Spring came late that year to Cold Spring, Wyoming. It came in the 2nd week of April, in a rush of green up the creek bottoms and yellow on the ridges, and the roan mare foaled in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon while Eli watched with his eyes wide as saucers and his small hand tight around Silas's thumb. The foal was a filly, black with a white blaze exactly like Cyrus Lowe's black gelding, which nobody said out loud, but everyone thought, and Eli named her Ruth after his mother without asking anybody's permission, and Silas said that was the right name and no other name would do. The quilt lived on the bed now. Silas slept in the bedroom again. Sometimes, on cold nights, Eli would come in and lay down on top of the quilt beside him, and Silas would put an arm across the boy the way a man puts an arm around a thing he intends to keep, and they would sleep like that, the two of them, under the blue and cream squares Martha had cut and stitched with her own living hands a lifetime ago. One evening in the first true warmth of May, Silas sat on the porch and watched Eli in the pasture below the house, running through the tall new grass with the black filly following him like a dog. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the light was the color of clean honey, and the boy was laughing the way boys laugh when they have finally, at last, forgotten to be afraid. Silas held a cup of coffee that was warm this time and drank from it and watched them. He thought of Martha. He thought of the tear along the bottom of the quilt and the small even stitches a stranger's child had made in the yellow lantern light of a barn on a winter night. He thought of the 6 years he had spent believing he was a man with nothing left to give. He had been wrong about that. He supposed a man could be wrong for 6 years and still have time. The boy came running up the slope toward the house with the filly behind him and his hair sticking up in the back the way it always did, and Silas Boone stood up from his porch chair to meet him, and behind them both, along the ridge, the last light of the day went gold, and then rose, and then quiet. And somewhere in the pines an owl called once, and this time got an answer. Next, we'll tell you the story of a widow who inherited a failing cattle ranch on the edge of Montana, and the drifter who arrived at her gate one October morning with a bullet in his shoulder, a stolen ledger in his saddlebag, and the name of the man who had killed her husband written on the inside of his coat. Stay close. Keep the fire burning. We'll see you then.